Patrick.
Laura.
Good morning.
So it's day 2 of an era-defining Trump 2 muscular gunboat diplomacy news event.
It is. And while President Trump said it was amazing watching the strikes on Venezuela on the television, it was like a TV show. This is not a TV show. Do not adjust your sets. We are on day 2 of a very important, significant American action, seizing the leader of a foreign country, taking him to America where he will stand trial. So Nicolas Maduro is now in New York in handcuffs, having been made to do the perp walk in front of the world.
And that's where we begin Sunday's newscast.
Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
It's Paddy in the studio.
And it's Henry in the studio.
IRL, as the kids would say, in real life. It's lovely to have you with us.
A New Year's surprise.
Especially because we will talk about a bit later our long interview with Keir Starmer. That is all there, newscasters, for you in your feeds as a separate episode. You can listen to the whole thing in its glory or grisly detail, however you feel about it. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes' time. So it's great you're here with us to help unpick the political intrigue.
First, President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela was plucked in his pajamas from his bed, trying to make it to the safe room in his fortress, as the US president has called it, and is now in the United States of America. The aircraft flying him was made to go past the Statue of Liberty in scenes that really were made for television. And he's done, as Laura told us, the perp walk. Maduro manacled, the foe of Donald Trump, now facing American justice with global reaction ignited.
That's right. And you can see how different countries are lining up to take different tacks. You can see Western allies have all sort of landed on this slightly fence-sitting line, but I think that reflects the difficulty of how they can handle it, which if we sum it up, they say, well, Maduro is a wrong-un, but we kind of hope that Trump didn't break the rules, but nobody's sad about this happening.
Yeah, and I think, we'll come on to the fuller aspects of your interview with Keir Starmer, but his position seems to be that he's stressed the importance of international law. He does not yet have a view on whether this broke international law, and Nicolas Maduro was not a good thing. I don't think he is able necessarily to keep juggling all those balls in the air simultaneously for much longer. I think he's going to have to pick sort of 2 of those 3 to stick to.
Not least because in this country, you've got political rivals saying, well, go on and condemn it, like the Lib Dems and the Greens. There are already Labour MPs saying it should be condemned. But also we're starting today on day 2 of this huge story, have international organisations like the UN's Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, saying he's deeply alarmed by the military operation in Venezuela. But there's a lot kind of swirling around, and the pictures of what's happened are completely extraordinary, and they've been posted all over the world by the White House and others. The Americans have released all sorts of footage of what's happened through their own channels. But what we don't know yet, Paddy, is what's actually going to happen in Venezuela. You know, Donald Trump made this amazing claim yesterday saying American oil companies were going to go in and make billions of dollars and America's going to run it. But we don't know how that's going to work.
Yes, because really there are different horses to back in Venezuela, because all of the Maduro regime is still there, including the woman he picked as vice president, who has been negotiating with the White House, we're told, and with whom Donald Trump has said he will work, Rodríguez, the vice president. Meanwhile, there is an opposition leader, Machado, who beat him to the Nobel Peace Prize, with whom he's not working. And I spoke to Carrie Filippetti, who was a US representative to Venezuela, and she told me that she thought that was a strategic mistake by the White House, because Machado is the leader of the opposition and won the Nobel Prize for fighting the same problem, Maduro, who's said to have stolen the election. So she's got legitimacy and support, and the vice president was appointed by Maduro, the man that the White House says is the enemy.
There are those suggestions, and we don't know if this is true. But if you look at some of the reporting and if you look at some of the speculation, and let's be clear, on day 2 of a story like this, there is a lot of theorising around, some by people who are experts, some by people, frankly, who are not experts. But of course, there are questions being asked about whether the White House had dealings with other people inside the Maduro regime before they actually got him out and got him on a chopper.
Well, there certainly seem to be quite strong suggestions that at the very least there were assets for the US in the Maduro regime who were able to assist the US in working out how to get to what Paddy says, the US described as Maduro's fortress.
Where he was going to be in his
exfiltrate
pajamas.
it. Exactly. I mean, that clearly is just an audacious military / law enforcement activity from the US forces. I think one thing that's also really quite interesting that I thought from the Trump press conference, and I think we'll see develop over the next few days, is that the US is essentially presenting this international maneuver as a mere matter of domestic law. They say, look, Nicolas Maduro and his wife are facing a US indictment, so we're bringing them to face justice in the US. There's sort of no reference to international law. And that is obviously going to present a problem for all sorts of world leaders who do talk about international law. And obviously, not to sound parochial, but Sir Keir Starmer, former Director of Public Prosecutions, who wrote a textbook on various aspects of international law, is one of those leaders. So that is an issue.
And he didn't back the war in Iraq, even though that had a UN resolution. So in this situation, this has not got UN backing. This is an isolated American decision. Its legal position is not clear. And as you say, this puts this whole issue of the flexibility of international law and how politicians respond and use it to their own advantage or disadvantage, that puts that right back on the table.
Because what President Trump has done is what President Putin wanted to do in Ukraine. It was take your guy out. And Putin thought he could do it in 3 days and has killed or wounded nearly 1 million men because it's united the West, or it did unite the West in opposition to contra international law invasion of Ukraine. And Donald Trump's got his man in a 2-hour operation to taking him into a US court.
But the interesting thing here is always it's a reminder that international law is the law until it's not, right? So we should not pretend, and no politician should pretend, although they often do, that international law is somehow written on a tablet of stone, and it is not, as all laws are, open to interpretation. And it was interesting, we had Grant Shapps, the former Defence Secretary, on the panel with us this morning, who, as he shared with us, once ordered a gunboat to go to Venezuela to send a message to Maduro. But what he said is he thinks the Tories should back these strikes and say, yes, they were a good thing and, in a sense, hang international law. His point was, he said, it breaks my heart that Trump might not do the same in Moscow. So the question is, international law can be very flexible, but where does it apply and where does it not? Because the political contexts actually are so often the real deciders.
Well, and if we are moving into a world, some would say we've long been in this world, where the great powers, the US, Russia, China, simply declare that international law is what they're doing, or they openly don't care about international law, then does the UK, and perhaps to some extent the EU, and NATO countries besides the US, start to look a little bit irrelevant, peripheral, outdated, and might Sir Keir Starmer come to be seen as a symptom of that? And I think that gets to the bigger question, which I already thought was going to be one of the big questions of 2026, and I think I've said this on Newscast, but much more so now, which is Sir Keir Starmer getting enough benefit out of his relationship with Donald Trump to justify the undoubted political difficulties here in the UK of having politicians to his left saying, why aren't you standing up to this man?
And there is that question of sort of the normies looking like the ones who are behind the curve, right? And I think we've already seen that in a way. I mean, I remember some of the speeches that Theresa May was making after the Salisbury poisonings and things like that. She was standing up and it felt like a big political moment. I remember a speech that she gave in the States when she'd been to see Trump. And I think it was then a speech given in Philadelphia. I'd have to go back to my dusty old notebooks to be sure about that. But she was standing up saying, the rules-based order is under threat. Well, we're really, really in that place now, and warnings about that had been made for a long time. But if you think also about what happened dominating much of the news last year in the Israel-Gaza conflict, huge unhappiness in this country and others about how far their ally Israel was pushing anything like the remote norms of military action and what should be acceptable during a time of conflict. So I think as we begin 2026, Henry, I think you're absolutely right. It's likely to be an ongoing feature of this year, but it's a kind of development we've seen building up in our politics, and this sort of strong men. If the strong men are strong men, and you're a bit of a normie, do you actually look like you've got much influence?
Can I offer up one more niche fact that I've learned this morning while trying
the right
to
place for it.
work out what's going on? I mentioned this domestic trial that Maduro and his wife are going to face in New York. The judge who has been assigned to preside over it is 92 years old.
Wowzers. That's amazing.
And they say that US politicians are getting older.
There's a word for it. Is it gerontocracy?
Gerontocracy.
Gerontocracy. That's how it's pronounced. I was aware of the letters, but not necessarily in the right order. And the other thing I would just put out there, because newscasters will be shouting this at their earbuds, is that the West loves to take out the leaders of oil powers. We've been doing it for years. And it doesn't always go very well. The what happens next question was famously not asked in Iraq. So there's loads of listeners who think the West has not learned its lessons. Never mind what the East is doing. Never mind what the war of aggression launched by President Putin. So let's come back to the other points of order raised in the interview between the Prime Minister and the newscast princess, Laura Kuenssberg. What was, I mean, firstly,
Yes.
Henry, I said to Laura yesterday, it's quite retro to do 45 minutes with a Prime Minister on TV.
Yeah, so retro that I have to confess, I don't think I've often seen it in my lifetime, certainly my time covering politics. I know that it was a thing decades ago, but decades now.
I don't think I've ever seen it. I don't think I've seen it either. I mean, I didn't watch Walden when I was a kid. I was like riding my bike or eating sweets.
I did. But what was the negotiation like with the number 10? Can you spill the tea?
Well, I didn't go to Downing Street and said, I am the new Walden, the legendary interviewer of decades gone by, who had the show the Sunday morning slot on ITV for many years and used to do these incredible big long interviews that I didn't watch when I was a kid, and famously had these big binders, the sort of huge binders of information to kind of plan these interviews. And, you know, if they say yes, go to page 9. If they say no to that question, go to page 12 or whatever. But Keir Starmer, interestingly, had been doing some longer interviews on other podcasts, including this one some time ago. And I just thought, can we give it a go? There's a convention, although Keir Starmer didn't do it last year, but there was a convention that the Prime Minister always does an interview in the first week of January. We did that with Rishi Sunak the year before, remember him? But Keir Starmer wasn't up for it last year. But so, you know, I suggested, look, we'd love to have him on in the first week of the year. Let's sort of revive that convention. And of course, if you do our jobs, you'd always push to do an interview with the Prime Minister. And we just thought, look, why not see if they want to translate what they've done in some other formats. Let's see if we can do something really long and see how it works. I would say I think it was a bit of an experiment for them and also a bit of an experiment for us, because it's not been in vogue in television for a long time to have such a long conversation. I don't want to be self-indulgent going on about this, but
you've said people will either love it or hate it. And they'll be very rude. They can write and be very rude.
Oh, they will, undoubtedly.
Did you? No, they might have liked it. Both is possible.
All things are possible.
But Henry, did you see a different side of him? Because I mean, he is under the most extraordinary pressure to push off.
Yeah, as was a big feature of the interview was, you know, pressing that point to Sir Keir Starmer. And I think, you know, to look at it from the other end of the telescope, I know from speaking to people around Keir Starmer that for some time they've felt that one reason, they would not claim the main reason, but one reason for his unpopularity, which we should always remember because I think for many people this is a startling fact, is unprecedented.
It's epic. I mean, he is epically unpopular.
It's quite extraordinary for a Prime Minister who won a landslide 17 or so months ago. But one reason that people in Downing Street ascribe for that is that they believe he hasn't got a chance, partly because of the media, but partly because of them, various reasons, to just state his case, make his case. So I can see that that is what they were hoping for here. I guess the question, which I'll be really interested in back to Parliament tomorrow, speaking to Labour MPs, is whether they believe that at greater length he did manage to set out what they crave from him, which is a clearer vision for where he wants to take the country, or whether actually they just felt he was saying the same old things at greater length over a greater time period.
You know the scene in a really epic horror film where someone's trying to start the car and there's a big scary thing coming down the road and the car, you see the keys and you think of the Downing Street turning the key constantly.
Yeah.
Well, they're trying to turn the key 5 times. There was a reset, wasn't there? There was a reboot. There was a milestone. Yeah. But the papers over the holiday period told me that there is a landing zone, Laura. We've always tried to explore this because there's so much doom. There is a picture of falling interest rates, of some growth, of falling inflation, we voters may not feel it, but pay has been going up, and there is a potential future.
There is. I mean, you and I have been wanging on about it for months and months and months. Like, doom is doom, and doom can be in fashion, and doom has been in fashion for a long time, but fashions can change. And to just turn to what Keir Starmer said, that's clearly his pitch is, I'm optimistic and I'm confident, and 2026 is going to be a great year. And by the way, I'm not going anywhere. And a reminder, the interview's in your feed. Do listen to it, and we're not going to go through all of the clips here. But I suppose that's the main political message that they want to convey. But I wondered at the end of the interview, actually, if some people listening to that will just think, you don't get how much trouble you're in. So at the end, I kind of said to him, look, I've listened to you really carefully for many, many minutes. Isn't there a danger that you just sound complacent, and that giving lists of the things that he thinks have been good are not going to be enough to change the dial?
Well, and he was trying to be at pains to say, look, I get why people are frustrated. And, he had this bit
it takes
where
ages,
he spent a while adding up the number of times how old people would be if they were a certain age at the financial crash and a certain age now. And, of course he had to do that. That's a prerequisite of then making the argument that things are going to get better. But I think, as you got to at the end of the interview, the risk is that that's a category error, and that actually some people aren't frustrated at the slow pace of change. They just don't like him.
Yeah.
And they just don't like what he's doing. And I'm not sure for the slice of voters for whom that's the case, and you can argue over how big that slice of voters are, I'm not sure he offered anything new to change their minds in this interview.
So one of the things he did suggest, and actually we'll just briefly, if you haven't got time to listen to it or you haven't listened to it, yes, just if we sort of whiz through some of the lines. He said the whole news story about the Egyptian British activist Abdel Fattah, who'd said some outrageously offensive things online, and Keir Starmer had said he was delighted to welcome home. He said he regretted having said that, and that is a sort of mini story in its own right. He was very positive about the possibility of a peace deal in Ukraine. And he told us that on Tuesday this week, there are going to be talks between the Americans and the Europeans about how they integrate military efforts to give security guarantees to Ukraine. That could end up being a big story on Tuesday. But he also, which will be might be a sort of mini political explosion. He said he wanted much closer alignment in lots of different areas with the single market. Now, if you voted for Brexit or you're Nigel Farage, you might think, oh, hang on a minute, this is going to make me pretty cross. He always told me Brexit was safe in his hands, and now he's misled me on that too. If, on the other hand, you're in the progressive ranks of the Labour Party or you're a Lib Dem, you think, oh, well, that sounds interesting. Oh, maybe we might be in business here.
Well, and we should also say, as we enter the year which marks the 10th anniversary of the EU referendum, that the polling shows that a majority of the country, sometimes quite a significant majority, thinks that Brexit was a mistake. Now, that's not the same thing as saying necessarily that the same majority of the country wants the government to spend its energy doing more to renegotiate its relationship with Europe than it already is, because it is already doing quite a lot. I mean, it was rearing its head quite a lot towards the end of last year, but it's quite frustrating one to report on, because there was a Monday a few weeks before Christmas where Keir Starmer had, I think, an article in The Guardian and two speeches, in all of which he made similarly positive noises, not actually as far as he went with you in this interview, but positive noises about going further than currently planned to get closer to the EU. But then when I tried to report it out in the phrase, speak to people and ask them what was going on, it became clear there was much less to it than met the eye. It was a rhetorical turn of phrase, but actually, it's still just the negotiations that we knew about at the pretty significant UK-EU summit last year. And I'm still not clear that there is much more to this than just a kind of, beyond what we know about, which is quite significant, but I'm still not clear there is a developed plan within government to actually go way beyond what we know. And I think it might just be a sort of line to try to reassure progressives who might be quite frustrated that Keir Starmer isn't going further.
Because you mentioned the 10-year anniversary of the Brexit referendum. We'll probably look back and say Brexit gave birth to the new multi-party politics, and probably that was the death knell of traditional two-party system. We'll probably look back and say that. And one of the, let me limp to my conclusion. Some of the groups of people who are most upset at how Brexit turned out are Brexiteers
Yes.
who feel that they were let down. They were promised as voters, vote for my Brexit, oh British person, and immigration will fall. All that problem you've had with all the over demand on our services from people coming in, it's going to go down. So what happened? It went up. How much did it go up? To a record. So voters, that was the beginning of this breakup of who to trust and who to rely on. And I think that's one of the reasons why when we go into the next election, we're going to have 16-year-olds voting for multiple parties. And when Henry's on here saying what happened and you'll be there hosting the show, we'll go back to 2016 and say that's what started it all, multi-party Britain.
So I'm not sure that I completely agree with you on that, because we just had the coalition era before that. And remember, then everybody in that era went, oh, yes, look, multi-party politics, because we've got the SNP having swept through Scotland and they're now part of the picture. And we've got the Lib Dems even in government. But what I think you're right. I think people will see Brexit quite rightly as this sort of cataclysmic moment where the status quo was thrown up in the air. That's definitively the case. And the Conservative Party, which up until that point had been the most successful party in the history of the world, was cleaved in two, if that's the right word. And they've still struggled to come back from that. You know, there was this huge big split on the right. But I just wonder if we can be incredibly nerdy for a second this year. And I think what we might see, and which may last all the way till the 29 election, is what we're basically looking at. It's not two big parties, but two blocs. So does Keir Starmer become the leader of the bloc of people who see themselves as sort of progressive and kind of on the left? And that might include Labour voters, the Lib Dems, who are tipped definitely more to the left than they might have used to have done. The Greens, where do they fit into all of this? Then you've got your party over in the sort of left turn end of that. And then the bloc on the right, whether it's Reform and the Tories. And some of the biggest questions, I think, for us and for the country really are, how are those two blocs going to start operating together, if at all? So if there were to be a deal between Reform and the Tories, that completely transforms the numbers at every future election. If there were to be any kind of formal or even just an expansion, a deepening of the links between those different parties on the left, the kind of tactical voting we've already seen some of, a little pocket in Caerphilly. Plaid Cymru got that by-election. Reform were disappointed because some voters on the left decided to get together to stop Nigel Farage. And I think for 2026, maybe 27, 28, up to the next general election, that might be the really interesting thing that we're talking about for even longer than I've just been talking about it.
Because what you described, Laura, is essentially the electoral strategy for 2029, as far as we can tell, in Downing Street, which is to say that at the next general election, there will be a Nigel Farage candidate, i.e. Nigel Farage, and a not Nigel Farage candidate, which they hope to be Sir Keir Starmer. Essentially, they think that progressive voters who are frustrated with the government for all sorts of reasons will come home because they will not want Nigel Farage to be Prime Minister. And they made a big call, by the way, getting on for a year ago in Downing Street, to treat Nigel Farage like the leader of the opposition, which they would say is just a reflection of reality rather than the Conservatives. But one thing I keep thinking is, well, OK, but if Downing Street is willing to entertain the idea, indeed say it's inevitable, that on the right-wing bloc, the leader is going to be the guy who currently has 5 MPs, not the woman who currently has 120 odd, well, why is it obvious that the Labour Party leader would be the anointed not Farage candidate? Why could it not be Zach Polanski, who currently has 5 MPs? Why could it not be Sir Ed Davey, who has 80-odd MPs? I think it is slightly fraught with risk for them there.
What does it also, though, mean in terms of policy, right? Because if that is the clear decision, why then is Shabana Mahmood's immigration policy being cranked up, and her critics would say going closer to a Reform or Conservative style of policy? She would deny that. But in the Labour's first sort of year in government, there was a lot of, oh God, actually, Reform is rising up the rails. We need to be responding to the concerns of voters who might be tempted for Reform. If they've made a clear decision that actually they're looking the other way, you might expect them to be either rolling back on some of that or starting to push the buttons more firmly in the other direction. And this gets us back to where's the coherence of what they're trying to do in Number 10, and whether today there was any more definitive coherence from the Prime Minister in terms of what he was saying. I don't think there was, I think it was interesting language on Ukraine. That was a story. I think it was a story about the single market. There was his regret about Al Fatah, and there was the I'm not going anywhere. But did he come with a new script? I mean, or even just a new big plan. I mean, even on asylum hotels, he said, "Oh yeah, we'll shut them before 2029." That's a news story. But would he give us a date? No, he said, "I've told the system I want them to do it."
I can see, Henry, you're imminent.
Well, I thought the one bit that did come closest to a new argument, I'm interested in whether you think the same, Laura, was when he was talking about Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
And he said, look, I'm a student of history, and I know that if people go for the easy answer option, by which he means Nigel Farage, and then inevitably that government fails, it will keep going right and right
yes.
and right. And I thought that was quite close, but in a new form to the argument which went down very well on the left that he made at Labour Party conference, which began actually in his interview with you back then when he said that reforms plans were racist.
An interesting piece by the Times columnist Fraser Nelson saying there is a version of the future which includes zero net migration, as partly as a result of decisions taken by the last Conservative administration. But to your point about what Shabana Mahmood is doing, which does provoke people on the left, if there is no migration to the UK, where does that leave reform?
Well, that's true. And it's interesting when you talk to people in reform, sometimes at the top of the party, there's a fundamental question for them. If the other parties were doing well, if they were doing what they promised to do they need to exist? And some senior people in reform have been very candid to me and said, well, no, we don't. I mean, we're here because the others don't work. We're not here, people have said to me, because we have our own burning ambition and ideology that we're desperate to take the country towards a shining city on the hill. They would admit themselves they're here because what they would say is the what they call the monoparty or the uniparty. They basically say the Tory and Labour's both screwed up, and therefore we're filling a gap in the market. So that's an interesting thing. And if immigration were to fall significantly, but illegal immigration though, and it's the sites, I think, of those small boat crossings and the sites of asylum hotels, those are the things that I think have become so politically toxic in the last couple of years. So, and closing that down is just such a huge challenge. And this government has not made much visible progress. They would say they've got returns deals with countries around the world, and they're putting things in place now. And Shabana Mahmood's got a whole load of new measures on the way, which have to go through Parliament. There could be some very, very stormy debates around that. There's nothing at all clear that says they're going to have sorted it by the time of the next election.
Well, and also to draw an analogy on both illegal and legal migration, we've just seen with inflation, which has been at the heart of British politics for 3-4 years, that the Conservatives went into a general election saying, well, the rate at which prices are going up has fallen, i.e. inflation's come down. And people went, yeah, we're still really struggling with the cost of living and things are still really expensive. And I do think, I mean, it would be fascinating what the implications for British politics are if legal migration comes to net zero, as Fraser Nelson suggests it might. But I do think there's a possibility that the voters who are most exercised about immigration say, well, yeah, but all the people who came here in the so-called Boris wave and after are still here. And I'm not quite clear that it would completely reorientate British politics in the way that some people in the mainstream parties are hoping that it would.
OK, we'll be wrapping and looking ahead, but I just wonder, should we just drill into the fact that there's a famous Harold Wilson quote, what's going on, I'm going on. Is that what Keir said? Is that the message this morning, Keir Starmer's?
Yeah, I think it essentially was. And he all but promised you another long-form interview in the first week of January 2027, Laura. Yeah. I mean, for all the reasons we've talked about over newscasts recently, and for all the reasons I think we'll be talking about right through to the May elections, which Keir Starmer, by the way, began to argue, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more of this, these are not a referendum on national politics. But, yeah.
They're a referendum on national politics.
They are. I mean, of course, those races are important decisions for who runs our councils, who runs Holyrood, who runs the Senate in Wales. But they absolutely, certainly also are a test of Keir Starmer's own popularity. And whether he likes it or not, that's true for the public. Whether he likes it or not, that will be also true for many of his MPs. But I think, Henry, you're right. We heard that little flash of what that argument is going to be. But I did think that him saying, I will be sitting in this seat in 2027, that's the most definitive he's been. elsewhere in the interview, he said the kind of thing he said before, which is like, I was elected with a mandate of 5 years and I intend to serve that, but that was the most definitive I think he'd been, because at the conference, which was the last time we did a long interview with him, not quite this long, but it was long, we asked him, that's, what John Major said, put up or shut up. Wilson said, what's going on? I'm going on. And Keir Starmer then said, give me space and give me time. And then started talking about his mandate, this time saying, I will be in this seat by 2027 and I will lead us into the next election for that fight against Nigel Farage. I think it's the most definitive that he's been. But I would love to know, Henry, what all those MPs queuing up to speak to you on Monday in Portcullis House in Westminster tomorrow. Are they all back tomorrow or is it Tuesday?
It's tomorrow, isn't it? I think it's tomorrow.
I don't know.
I mean, it'll be tomorrow. I just want to say,
I don't know, I'm having a
public
lie
service
down.
message for any Labour MPs. I'll be sitting in Portcullis House from about 10:30 a.m. tomorrow.
Do you sit there with a sort of, with a begging bowl? Or how do people come over?
I think my presence is is a sort of metaphorical begging bowl. There's a crucial seat as you come up the escalator.
The seat of destiny.
Oh, yes, I've seen
and
you
it's very
there.
impossible to dodge me. Very hard to dodge me. Sorry, it's not impossible. People are quite good at it. If I'm sitting there,
because I was told there's a similar seat in the House of Lords where one peer told me he liked to sit, get all the gossip, but there was famously a mouse that used to sit under the seat that was known as the Mouse of Lords, and I'd see you as a sort of similar muse in the Commons.
Well, there is certainly not just one mouse in the Houses of Parliament, be it literal or metaphorical.
But are there any rats? Ho, ho, ho. I had a different tactic. I used to perambulate. So I used to walk around and bump into people that way. And then I used to go up and down the corridors where government ministers have their offices. And if you do that for about half an hour, you could bump into, however many government ministers. It used to be quite cunning.
And you get your steps up.
Yeah, and you get your steps up. Exactly. I mean, you probably also look a bit crackers, to be honest. But yeah, I used to walk around, also sit and drink cups of tea with people in Portcullis House. But sometimes people do that to be seen.
So that's the look ahead. Parliament returns.
Yeah.
Henry returns.
Yeah.
Also, Venezuela, we have a look ahead.
Huge. I mean, look, that's going to rumble on. It could. Who knows which way that will go next? But Maduro, we expect to appear in court in New York this week with his wife. Beyond that, look, we don't know. I'm sure there'll be questions in Parliament about it, statements in Parliament. There might be some kind of session at the UN, but we're sort of...
There is.
We're sort of guessing a bit, aren't we?
Well, an emergency Security Council meeting called by Colombia with the backing of Russia and China, we do expect as a look ahead.
Oh, so excellent. You had the facts. I didn't.
The editor wrote it down for me to say. I thought you were going to say it, but it falls to me. But I'm only reading. So there we are. Look, Henry... you're Henry at home to me, and now you're Henry in the flesh. It's a lovely thing.
I feel at home wherever I'm talking about the news with you two.
There we are. Well, it's been lovely to have you with us in real life. And newscasters, Happy New Year. It's lovely to have you back with us from our weekend perches. And if you do want to listen, the whole Keir Starmer interview is in your ears on BBC Sounds, and it's on iPlayer if you want to watch back. And of course, there's screeds of other bits and pieces of it, and some women rattling on about what they thought online as well. So there we are.
And Adam's here tomorrow. Thank you for joining Sunday's newscast. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.